Masses, Elites, and Rebels. The Theory of Brainwashing by Roderick Day. Quote, despair is typical of those who do not understand the causes of evil, see no way out, and are incapable of struggle. The modern industrial proletariat does not belong to the category of such classes. V.I. Lenin, 1910. Quote, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stomping on the human face forever. O'Brien, the triumphant antagonist of George Orwell's 1984. Introduction. I've become very skeptical of the concept of brainwashing. Over the past few months, this skepticism has boiled over into open and explicit disagreement with even well-meaning pushers within the Marxist-Leninist corner. I often find it difficult to explain concisely why it is that I'm increasingly hostile to the almost undisputed preeminence the theory enjoys. Because it is a very extensive and complete theory, even though it's rarely fully laid out for cross-examination. Since I am active in the project of documenting and exposing atrocity propaganda narratives, my antagonism tends to cause confusion. In this essay, I will attempt to offer a systematic explanation for why I believe we should basically abandon the concept of brainwashing in its entirety, and what I believe is the correct replacement for it in every instance: the notion of licensing. I'm not speaking here as an outsider. Not long ago, I wrote an essay titled Brainwashing, and it basically amounted to an accusation of hypocrisy. Westerners accuse everyone in adversary nations of being victims of brainwashing. But what about their own? I attempted to illustrate, by citing verifiable incidents of major historical consequence, the main characteristics of the modern Western propaganda strategy. I also highlighted the historical origin of the term brainwashing in the journalistic work of undercover CIA agent Edward Hunter. However, my protest against the usage of the term was much milder, limited to distancing myself from uncritical usage by consistently encasing it in quotation marks. In retrospect, my strategy could be summarized as an attempt to expand the scope of the concept in hopes that it might acquire a more universal and self-critical character. My current strategy does not represent a break with that previous effort, but instead is a kind of radicalization thereof. In short, this essay will make the case that brainwashing as a political theory breaks society down into three mutually exclusive camps. 1. A group of elite manipulators. 2. Vast masses under their control. And 3. A rebellious group of enlightened critics, to which the person launching the accusation of brainwashing implicitly always belongs, since they are neither unaware of it or abetting it. An unstated premise of this political theory is that what determines which of these camps any individual belongs to is a mixture of intellectual enlightenment and moral purity. Unsurprisingly, this purely ideological tripartite division doesn't map well to Marxist class analysis. In fact, it obscures it, with catastrophic consequence for political strategy. As soon as the problem is understood, however, the way out becomes clear. The bourgeois proletariat. Quote, the English proletariat is actually becoming more and more bourgeois, so that this most bourgeois of all nations is apparently aiming ultimately at the possession of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat alongside the bourgeois. Lenin, 1916, citing correspondence from Engels to Marx. Quote, and they believed him? I don't think anyone actually believed it. He just said it, and no one had the balls to defy him. Captain Garrett to Billy Bones, Black Sails. Anyone working in counter-propaganda can testify to a curious experience. We'll put in hours of careful research collecting an impeccable set of resources that undermine some warmongering narrative, and we'll eagerly share it with someone who claims to despise racism in all its forms, say an outspoken opponent of the West's so-called war on terror. Unexpectedly, we are met with a response that is somewhere between chilly reticence and downright hostility. What's going on? From our perspective, we're offering water to a person who self-identified as thirsty, and yet they react as if we're trying to poison them. They turn on a dime to defend the same institutions whose lies they were denouncing just moments before. At this point, the sense of pride and accomplishment that comes from seeing through propaganda and putting puzzle pieces together into a satisfying historical account gets brutally transformed into its exact opposite, a sense of crushing defeat. In response to this bitter experience, many researchers, Serious people with plenty of experience reading and writing, and sometimes even of being published, lash out. They decide that people have been brainwashed beyond the point where they can be reached by words or rational appeal. They realize that the masters of propaganda have been far more successful than we first imagined. It turns out we're not David fighting Goliath. We're more like an ant facing an asteroid. The same inquisitive nature that first led them to unravel war propaganda narratives begins to feed an even larger psychohistorical narrative, and nihilism takes hold. The tragic cycle begins to appear eternal. Innocent, well-meaning, hard-working folks are time and again viciously tricked by the scapegoating of a new rogue in the gallery. Indigenous, Black, Spanish, Jewish, Soviet, Vietnamese, Cuban, Serbian, Muslim, Libyan, Syrian, Korean, Venezuelan, Russian, Chinese. Due to the sheer power of propaganda and mass media, the masses helplessly fall for hatred and volunteer for war, even though it comes at a very high cost to ourselves, our loved ones, and our ideals, religion, environmentalism, etc. Sadly, the innate human propensity to hate the other seals our fate as a society, or something along those lines. I'm going to argue that this narrative is nonsense. It tries to pass off as universal and eternal something that in reality is particular and ephemeral. In short, Westerners aren't helpless innocents whose minds are injected with atrocity propaganda, science fiction style. They're generally smug bourgeois proletarians who intelligently seek out as much racist propaganda as they can get their hands on. This is because it fundamentally makes them feel better about who they are and how they live. The psychic material costs are rationally worth the benefits. As for those anti-imperialists who don't participate in this festival of xenophobia, and here I include myself, we have our own elitist consolation. We accept the tragedy of the masses of gullible sheeple falling for cunning propaganda, because having overcome it flatters our own intelligence. The more we condemn society's stupidity, the smarter we feel in comparison. But am I not just worsening the problem, aggravating our hopelessness, by criticizing the critics in a way that suggests that no one escapes ideological self-flattery? I don't think so. Paradoxically, it brings us all back to a more even and possibility-rich playing field. The prevailing populist narrative grants people of the West a moral innocence by attributing to them utter stupidity and naivete. I invert the equation and demand a Marxist narrative instead. Westerners are willingly complicit in crimes because they instinctively and correctly understand that they benefit as a class, as a global bourgeois proletariat, from the exploitation enabled by their military and their propaganda. In Gramscian terms, organs of coercion and consent. We're not as stupid as we're made out to be. This means that we can be reasoned with, and that there is a way out. None of this is meant to downplay the scale of the propaganda project. I've spent enough time chasing down leads on different intelligence fronts and their plots to know that they're real and they have real effects. I do not deny that the outcomes we observe are at all times incentivized and enforced, both overtly and covertly, by various societal superstructures like police, education, and culture, and that principled and effective truth-tellers have been assassinated. I reject only the common misconception that propaganda manufactures consent, Chomsky, or invents reality, Parenti, because it exaggerates the feat accomplished by propagandists, and in doing so, it obscures the real material basis that has historically made even the working poor in the imperial core complicit. Talk of manufacturing and inventing suggests an imposition over and against the individual's will. I believe that, on the contrary, the process of Western propaganda is better understood in terms of licensing, the issuing of moral license for the bourgeois proletariat to profitably go along with bourgeois designs without the feelings of shame overwhelming. In this alternative account, people aren't brainwashed insofar as they don't actually believe the lies, not in the way that we generally understand belief. It's more correct to say that they go along with them, whether enthusiastically or apprehensively, because it's actually their optimal survival strategy. When we concede that the time horizon and scope of responsibility within which we all make our decision varies, it becomes much easier to see how the choice could be smart and intelligent. The enlightened critic can plead that if we all agreed to denounce the status quo in unison, we'd be immensely rewarded. But the average worker in the first world cannot be accused of naivete for preferring to keep a low profile, particularly after being subject, very often by that same critic, to so many grim stories of murder and of punishment of how any attempt at radical change always goes awry. To color our understanding of this process, we can borrow here from a larger tradition, the counter-critique of consumerism. After all, news media, atrocity propaganda included, is itself a consumer product. We select it off digital shelves no differently than we select a candy bar or a novel. What this critical tradition focuses on is the strange harmonious coexistence of 1. Incessant advertising pressing us to spend our income on myriad of products, and 2. Scathing interventions berating us as a collective for indulging in those same vices. Western regimes brutally repressed communist organizers of every stripe, but French theorists inveighing against our unsalvageable vulgarity somehow always found the fashionably marginal soapbox. Sometimes, such as in Pixar's WALL-E, the consumerist blockbuster and the sermon against consumerism are one and the same. In this social context, it becomes interesting and rare to find defenders of consumerism as such. These defenders don't aim to defend imperialism or wanton environmental waste, but instead to defend the rationality of undergirding what is so often dismissed as manipulation. These thinkers highlight how the masses have been accused of being tacky and short-sighted in their tastes and decision-making prowess for as long as there have been economic elites able to look down their noses at them. Consider Ellen Willis. Quote, "If white radicals are serious about revolution, they're going to have to discard a lot of bullshit ideology created by and for educated white middle-class males. A good example of what has to go is the popular theory of consumerism, as expounded by many leftist thinkers, notably Marcuse. This theory maintains that consumers are psychically manipulated by mass media to crave more and more consumer goods, and thus power an economy that depends on constantly expanding sales. When a woman spends a lot of money and time decorating her home or herself, or hunting down the latest vacuum cleaners, it is not idle self-indulgence, let alone the result of psychic manipulation, but a healthy attempt to find outlets for her creative energies within her circumscribed role. Consider Tracy McMillan Cotton. If I need a job that will save my lower back and move my baby from Medicaid to an HMO, how much should I spend signaling to people like my former VP that I will not compromise her status by opening the door to me? That candidate maybe could not afford a proper shell. I will never know, but I do know that she had gone hungry for 2 days to pay for it or miss wages for a trip to the store to buy it. She may have been rewarded a job that could have lifted her above minimum wage. Consider Aisha Landa. Quote, "Liberal strategy regularly revolves precisely around the conviction that anti-fascism must entail curbing and diluting as much as possible the political influence of the masses, seen as an irascible force, threatening to undermine liberal democracy, either acting on its own impulses or being goaded by reckless demagogues into a frenzy of destruction. Given the presumed affinity between democracy and dictatorship, the best recipe is to ensure that liberal democracy stays just that, liberal, keeping the mass beast contented, perhaps, but never allowing it to roam free around the social arena." Much of left-wing theory echoes these concerns in its critique of the culture industry and of mass consumerism, understood as forms of political indoctrination, mind-numbing, and pacification. End quote. The attitude being identified here by these three writers in the context of consumerism has explanatory power in the narrower context of counter-propaganda. In my experience, it's too often the case that the keenest and most trenchant critics of propaganda become cynical, depressed, and resigned. Their interpersonal behavior becomes condescending and thus repulsive, and it gets to the point that they make the causes that they ostensibly advocate for appear dire and unappealing. Vast troves of historical knowledge should be a weapon in the hands of our best champions against CIA propaganda. But these bookworms often end up being the most convinced believers within our camp that the enemy's victory is inevitable. They're in fact scarcely an inch removed from Marx's scathing 1844 sketch of the young Hegelians. Quote, That very school of criticism has proclaimed itself the pure, resolute, absolute criticism which has achieved self-clarity, and in its spiritual pride has reduced the whole process of history to the relation between the rest of the world, which comes into the category of the masses, and itself. It has assimilated all dogmatic antithesis into one dogmatic antithesis between its own sagacity and the stupidity of the world. It has daily and hourly demonstrated its own excellence against the mindlessness of the masses. The school of criticism has made known in print its superiority to human feelings and the world, above which it sits enthroned in sublime solitude, with nothing but an occasional roar of sarcastic laughter from its Olympian lips." End quote. The problem here, in short, is elitism. Unchecked, presumed to have been neutralized in some way by the adoption of countercultural ethos, it festers. The way to solve it, however, is not to shy away from studying or exposing bourgeois propaganda, but to delve even deeper and radicalize our understanding of it. In my view, this entails accepting that the main way propaganda safeguards power today, whether patriarchal or anti-communist or white supremacist or environmental, is through licensing people to embrace resignation as the smartest choice. This is achieved by demoralization. The ruling class has received a lot of support from radical thinkers in this endeavor ever since brainwashing as a political theory went mainstream. Let us look at a specific example. A claim like, "There's cultural genocide of Uyghurs in Xinjiang," is simply unreal to most Westerners, close to pure gibberish. The words really refer to existing entities and geographies, but Westerners aren't familiar with them. The actual content of the utterance as it spills out is no more complex or nuanced than "China bad." And the elementary mistake people make when they write out statements of solidarity make that much clear. This is not a complaint that these people have not studied China enough. There's no reason to expect them to study China, and retrospectively, I think to some extent it was a mistake to personally have spent so much time trying to teach them. It's instead an acknowledgement that they are eagerly wielding the accusation like a club, that they are in reality unconcerned with its truth content because it serves a social purpose. What is the social purpose? Westerners want to believe that other places are worse off, exactly how Americans and Canadians perennially flatter themselves by attacking each other's decaying healthcare systems, or how a divorcee might fantasize that their ex-lover's blooming love life is secretly miserable. This kind of crab mentality is actually a sophisticated coping mechanism suitable for an environment in which no other course of action seems viable. Cognitive dissonance, the kind that eventually spurs one into becoming intolerant of the status quo and into action, is initially unpleasant and scary for everybody. In this way, we can begin to understand the benefit that victims of propaganda derive from carelessly spreading awareness. Their efforts feed an ambient propaganda haze of controversy and scandal and wariness that suffocates any painful optimism or jealousy and ensuing sense of duty one might otherwise feel from a causal glance at the amazing things happening elsewhere. People aren't falling for atrocity propaganda, they're eagerly seeking it out, like a soothing balm. We should also wonder how appreciation of the sophistication and totality of the propaganda apparatus and its ongoing representation squares with the peculiar kind of critical media that does not make it to wide circulation, usually to universal praise from both the mainstream media and the countercultural left. Women getting constantly raped and murdered and filmed is deemed a protest against the patriarchy. Black people getting mauled by dogs, the most horrifying traumas in their history, ritualistically reenacted in high definition, is an assault on white supremacy. Disaster movies insist that the end of the world is inevitable, that we're all complicit in ecological devastation for not doing our part recycling cans. This is environmental critique. Triumphant, handsome, charismatic, alpha men climb the top of their respective empires of crime in the highest budget four-season shows and are awarded the highest accolades in their profession. This passes for an indictment of capitalism. Eileen Jones insightfully observes about David Fincher's Gone Girl. Even as I watched it and shuddered with revulsion, I had to admit, Fincher's got our number. He's figured out how to regularly wow contemporary audiences to present us with the appalling truth of how despicable we are in a way that never really strikes home. By alternating coldly disapproving, feel-bad effects with conspiratorial smirking ones that remove any real sting. He so often uses the trappings of film noir to showcase our badness, but since we're all perverts together, it's just the badness of S&M sex play, so who cares? End quote. This license to feel despondent, and yet always superior, comes in many forms. However, it is handed down to many of us in the Anglophone world very early on in our schooling, in the form of the parables of one universally beatified St. George. George Orwell's very British anti-Semitism. Quote, "The farm possessed 3 horses now, besides Clover. They were fine, upstanding beasts, willing workers and good comrades, but very stupid. None of them proved to be able to learn the alphabet beyond the letter B." George Orwell. Quote, "You read enough books in which people like you are disposable, or are dirt, or are silent, absent, or worthless, and it makes an impact on you. Because art makes the world. Because it matters. Because it makes us or breaks us." Rebecca Solent, 2015. These days, Orwell's reputation among socialists is in well-deserved shambles. Invocations of the specter of his memory as some kind of aspirational revolutionary ideal, as a staunch opponent of totalitarianism, are increasingly buried under citations proving he was in fact a colonial cop, a rapist, a snitch, a racist, a proud Englishman, and so on. However, his work fares much better. Whenever a bourgeois state makes its presence felt, even communist and anti-imperialist critics cannot seem to resist adding color to their harsh indictments by sprinkling in reference to the Ministry of Truth or Big Brother. The notion of the death of the author offers intellectual cover. We're all familiar with the work, and it triggers some familiar and suitable mental images. What harm could it do? Let's start by stating unambiguously that George Orwell was certainly Judeophobic, as the work he carried out on behalf of British intelligence readily attests. Quote, "There is a noble and obvious overlap in Orwell's notebook between many of 1940s London prominent gay, Jewish, and anti-colonial public figures and the accused cryptos. Orwell's bigoted commentaries fill his suspects' notebooks. Jews are clearly labeled Polish Jew, English Jew, Jewess, whilst others were mislabeled Charlie Chaplin, Jewish? End quote. However, this must be understood beyond simple apathy. After all, Orwell displays a serious degree of relative sympathy for Trotsky. In Animal Farm, the Trotsky figure, Snowball, is always favorably compared to the Stalin figure, Napoleon, and likewise in 1984, with the renegade Goldstein compared to the ruling Big Brother. To fully understand the way Orwellian critique is anti-Semitic, then it's necessary to understand the relationship between anti-Semitism and Judeophobia. Richard Levy explains, quote, "What prompted the coining of the neologism anti-Semitism was the perception of an altered relationship between Jews and the people among whom they lived that could not accurately be described as mere Judeophobia or Jew hatred. The felt need for a new word affected not just self-identified anti-Semites. It was recognized by Jews and non-Jews throughout Europe and wherever Europeans settled in the world. Anti-Semitism as a concept in the movement was a response to the so-called Jewish question, which was itself precipitated by the remarkable economic, cultural, and political ascent of the Jews during the 19th century and their entry into mainstream European life. For some of the people among whom they lived, this rapid accumulation of power was ominously threatening. Accustomed to seeing Jews as small-time chiselers, heretics, peddlers, and parasites, they were now confronted by Jewish political leaders, cultural luminaries, bankers, captains of industry, army officers, professors, and bosses. No longer powerless outsiders, Jews were seen as wielders of surreptitiously acquired power. Seeing only the dramatic success stories, this view ignored the thousands of still impoverished Jews dwelling in Eastern Europe and in the slums of Central and Western European cities. Nevertheless, it was the fear of what Jews would do with their wildly exaggerated power that animated efforts to disempower them before it was too late, first in Germany and then in many other countries." End quote. The 19th century was a time of triumphal imperial apogee, where the sun never sets on the British Empire, and Jews were certainly not the only ethnic minorities cohabiting with white Europeans. Antagonism and phobia brewed wherever whites abusively interacted with East Asian, South Asian, Latin American, African, Middle Eastern people. Why was it Judeophobia in particular that metastasized into extremely politically organized anti-Semitism? It's essential to grasp that the fall of the Roman Empire weighed very heavily in the imagery of the European ruling class, particularly in the aftermath of the momentous events such as the French Revolution and the Paris Commune. And so, European ruling classes pondered the fall of the Roman Empire and wondered if and how theirs would meet their own. Friedrich Nietzsche was one of many intellectuals who devoted his life to studying this tragedy. In The Genealogy of Morals, a title which should be read quite literally, he traces it thus. It was the Jews who, in opposition to the aristocratic equation, good equals aristocrat, equals beautiful, equals happy, equals loved by the gods, dared with a terrifying logic to suggest the contrary equation, and indeed to maintain with the teeth of the most profound hatred, the hatred of weakness. This contrary equation, namely, the wretched alone are good, the poor, the weak, the lowly are alone the good, the suffering, the needy, the sick, the loathsome are the only ones who are pious, the only ones who are blessed. For them alone is salvation. But you, on the other hand, you aristocrats, you men of power, you are to all eternity the evil, the horrible, the covetous, the insatiate, the godless. Eternally also you shall be the unblessed, the cursed, the damned. It was in fact with the Jews that the revolt of the slaves begins in the sphere of morals. That revolt which was behind it a history of 2 millennia, and which at present day only has moved out of our sight because it has achieved victory. End quote. Nietzsche here is furiously railing against the narrative of the chosen ones. In his view, Jewish history is one of ultimate vengeance, but not in prophetic or religious terms. Their national revolt, one of the first major anti-imperialist movements in human history, is seen from the perspective of the Roman ruling class against which they rebelled. The first act ends with the fall of Jerusalem, a brutal and relentless Roman siege and occupation after which Jewish people were exiled from their homeland and dispersed. The second act is the toppling of the Roman Empire by Christianity, which is seen as the culmination of the slow but steady and purposeful spread of slave morality by the vanquished. Jewish people are seen by Nietzsche to eventually prevail in a terrifying victory over the mighty Romans, one which continued to threaten to consume everything he deemed beautiful and sublime. Nietzsche was particularly horrified by atrocity propaganda, falsely accusing French communards of burning down the Louvre. There is a logic here, and it's the same exact logic that would later find expression in the genocidal Nazi project. It's a logic which enables us to understand why those anti-Semites continued to pursue extermination, even after their hopes of territorial conquest were extinguished. To paraphrase Che Guevara's last words, they were trying to kill an idea. What is often forgotten, or rather deliberately obscured, is that this line of thinking, far from being a strange German quirk, enjoyed complete hegemony throughout the imperial white supremacist world. Winston Churchill, a born aristocrat and then ascendant political figure, mourned the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, publicly and for mass circulation in 1920s newspaper in these peculiar terms. Quote, "This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx, and down to Trotsky in Russia, Bela Kun in Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, Emma Goldman in the US, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It played, as modern writer Mrs. Webster has so ably shown, a definitely recognizable part in the tragedy of the French Revolution. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. And now, at last, this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of the heads and have become practically the undisputed masters of that enormous empire. Although in all these countries there are many non-Jews, every whit as bad as the worst Jewish revolutionaries, the part played by the latter in proportion to their numbers in the population is astonishing." End quote. With this historical context at hand, we can ask ourselves some questions about Orwell's much celebrated and oddly embraced socialist body of work. Why does Animal Farm, an allegory so unimaginative it even mocks the anthem of the Internationale, not feature a metaphor of the Holocaust? Why does 1984 feature an English hero in Winston Smith and an Irish villain in O'Brien? How come both Animal Farm and 1984 studiously ensure that we understand that Napoleon and Big Brother are both caricatures of Stalin, while neglecting to introduce any Hitler, to say nothing of Churchill standing? Orwell provides an unambiguous answer in his review of Mein Kampf. Quote, "I should like to put it on record that I've never been able to dislike Hitler. Ever since he came to power, I have reflected that I would certainly kill him if I could get within reach of him, but that I could feel no personal animosity. The fact is that there's something deeply appealing about him. One feels, as with Napoleon, that he's fighting against destiny, that he can't win, and yet he somehow deserves to. However they may be as economic theories, fascism and Nazism are psychologically far sounder than any hedonistic conception of life." End quote. At play here is a trite literary technique whereby the author, rather than assert his own preferences, attempts to accept himself from criticism by alleging that he's merely ventriloquizing the opinions of the dumb masses. However, something is evident. After the stunning upset Nazi Germany experiences at the hands of the Soviet Union, Orwell can't seem to help but tell and retell, depressed, the story of the taming of individualism at the hands of totalitarianism. In other words, the overarching tragedy of the 20th century for Orwell wasn't colonialism or fascism, it was the seemingly definitive victory of socialist statehood. What Orwell achieves in his work, and what makes it so politically useful to the ruling class that tiredly propagates it, is that he serviceably repackages the main tenets of anti-Semitic political project without the accompanying stench of Judeophobia. The point here is not to argue that Orwell and his crypto-fascism played a pivotal historical role, but rather to make it clear why the ruling class finds him and his ilk so non-threatening. After all, we could here easily substitute 1984 with its dystopian twin, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Although different in some important ways, they reproduce the same basic theory of society in the form of a cautionary tale. A few extraordinary rebels navigate a dystopia where a small clique of sinister elites already achieve full control over gullible and hedonistic hordes. The logic of anti-Semitism, far from being banished with the Nazis, became completely naturalized in the West. From Lord of the Rings to The Dark Knight Rises, we hear the same story again and again. Swarthy hordes are surreptitiously manipulated behind the scenes by crooked wizards and deceptive illusionists, often hiding in plain sight in our midst, and lay siege to everything that is balanced and well-rounded and pure and good and holy and white and which by right should be eternal. The manipulators do so for no discernible reason other than greed and resentment. It is in every instance nothing but the bourgeois terror of a worker uprising led by a communist party and made intelligible to adjacent social classes by appealing to their individualistic self-esteem. They claim that there are yet darker parts of the world above which the imperial poor can still stand tall. This is how it came to be that in 2022, the US-Russia proxy war in Ukraine is primarily depicted in Western media as hordes of subhuman Russian orcs under the commanding grip of a tiny, crooked, and often hook-nosed Vladimir Putin attacking Aryan European knights and damsels. Russia's actions are discussed, of course, not in terms of their explicitly declared national security concerns, but in terms of speculation about the depths of their envy, resentment, greed, inferiority, ugliness, jealousy, and depravity. Meanwhile, Andrei Beletsky, an avowed Nazi from Ukraine's National Guard who openly declared that the historic mission of our nation in this critical moment is to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade for their survival, a crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen, is glowingly cited in the Economist as one of the defiant, outnumbered defenders, blemished only abstractly by far-right sympathies. The Economist is, of course, not a left publication. Where is the left in all of this? The quintessential example is once again British. This is how Novara Media justified their giddy promotion of aforementioned anti-China atrocity propaganda campaigns. Quote, the Uyghur people are being persecuted by the Chinese state. The left must not be too afraid of siding with Western imperialists to act in solidarity. End quote. It would be unfair to shore this all up with Novara, however. After all, John Carpenter's 1988 sci-fi film, They Live, considered a rare left-wing classic, tells the story of a hunky white working American who dons glasses that allow him to see past the illusion and realize that custom reptilians control society through money and advertising. In disregarding with a superlicious handwave all evidence coming out of Xinjiang or Donbass by referring to the testimony of renegades in Washington, D.C., these leftists do speak with some force of authority compared to them by grand tradition. A left defined by petty bourgeois and bourgeois proletarians cannot help but flatter themselves in this self-flagellating way again and again. Lacking in imagination, but absolutely starved for respectability and approval, they freely denounce Stalin and Mao while attempting to build up Nietzsche and Orwell as authentic socialist revolutionaries in embryo. With the betrayal by an evil clique and brainwashing narratives in hand, these leftists pressed a Faustian bargain. Masses everywhere are granted innocence, but robbed of their intelligence. Salvation is not forthcoming in this life, but at least well-deserved. Ostensibly pro-worker theory, now suffused in elitism, nihilism, and condescension, becomes the doctrine of the petty bourgeois lumpen intelligentsia, repulsive to proletarians. Even staunch anti-imperialists are partly to blame for this state of affairs. It's foolhardy to insist that brainwashing rules the West and then act aghast that accusations of brainwashing are widely deployed by the West against its enemies in service of imperialism and war propaganda. If we allowed that this technique succeeded even once, then who's to say that it won't succeed again, or that it isn't already succeeding elsewhere or everywhere? This is the problem with embracing the tripartite narrative and identifying oneself as one of the enlightened rebels. Now, what would it look like if we were to reject this theory of brainwashing altogether and approach instead all of the aforementioned in an actually revolutionary way? Karl Marx, Tupac Shakur, and the Jewish question. Quote, nothing human is alien to me. Karl Marx's maxim, 1865. I had to grapple with Karl Marx's response to Bruno Bauer on the Jewish question for a while. Particularly the second part, the capacity of present-day Jews and Christians to become free. Because of a combination of its polemic character and philosophical complexity, it tends to be a rather under-discussed text. Some would understandably prefer it wasn't of the Marxist canon at all. Marx reproduces anti-Jewish stereotypes unabashedly and seemingly without a trace of a challenge. Quote, let us consider the actual worldly Jew, not the Sabbath Jew, as Bauer does, but the everyday Jew. Let us not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. What is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Very well then, emancipation from huckstering and money, consequently from practical real Judaism, would be the self-emancipation of our time. An organization of society which would abolish the preconditions for huckstering and therefore the possibility of huckstering would make the Jew impossible. End quote. And later on, quote, in the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. The Jew has emancipated himself in a Jewish manner, not only because he has acquired financial power, but also because through him, and also apart from him, money has become a world power, and the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of the Christian nations. End quote. What are we to make of this text? The usual response begins by pointing out that, although an atheist, Marx was ethnically Jewish. Because of the way stay in your lane discourse works today, this somewhat neutralizes the potential of the text as a shot against Marx's personal character. That said, this parts from a mutual agreement between Marxists and anti-Marxists that the text is abject, thus in need of apology. And my impression is that the result of this strategy is the work that receives little interest outside Marxology compared to his others. And my impression is that the result of this strategy is that the work receives little interest outside Marxology compared to his others. The problem with declaring Marx's maneuver here out of bounds is that it stops us from actually evaluating how well it works as a legitimate strategy to fight anti-Semitism. Bruno Bauer, whom Marx was writing against, was an anti-Semite. And more generally, how to fight any other vile idea. Properly understood, the strategy taken here by Marx is just part of the family of immanent critique in general. Rather than run away from the accusation, Marx leans into it, exposes its absurdity, radicalizes it into its opposite. As Neil Fromm puts it, once an idea has come up against its own limits, that's a blow it can't recover from. I propose that the best way for contemporary readers to understand what Marx was trying to do in that intervention against Bauer is, rather than pursue a complex philosophical exegesis, to look instead for a comparable example of how the same strategy would play out in a context that we're more familiar with. This happens to be essentially what the rap legend Tupac Shakur did in a 1995 interview. Quote, "Knowing what you know, what do you think about youth and gang violence in America? Especially in the Black communities and Hispanic communities using gang violence. I think I'm gonna get a lot of flack for it. I think gangs can be positive. It just has to be organized and has to steer away from being self-destructive to being self-productive. I think this country was built on gangs, and I think this country is still run on gangs. Republicans, Democrats, the police department, the FBI, the CIA, those are gangs. You know what I mean? The correctional officers. I had a correctional officer tell me straight up, we're the biggest gang in New York State. Straight up. This whole country is built on gangs. We just have to not be so self-destructive about it. Organized, But the violence, but it's violence in America. What did the USA just do? Flying to Bosnia. We ain't got no business over there. It's the same thing. How can they tell us not to have gangs? You know what gang violence is mostly? And the people don't want to hear this. Somebody shoots your family member, so of course you retaliate. Same thing the US does. Except nobody even shot their family members, They see somebody bomb a school and all these people get killed, so the United States is like, oh, that's messed up. We gotta show them who's the real killers. The same mentality these gangsters get. So until they stop that mentality, we won't stop. Or they won't stop. Because they watch this country to see what they do. America is the biggest gang in the world. Look how they didn't agree with Cuba. So what do? Cut them off. That's what we're doing in the street. We block things off. I want to say stop the violence. I want to say the violence ain't good. Why can't you say that? Because that's not realistic. I know it's not good. If anybody will speak up against violence, it'll be the brother that got shot 5 times. I got shot twice, all up in my... Trust me, violence ain't cool. And they know violence ain't cool. Ain't nobody out there with a gun saying it's cool to be shooting people. It's just, in certain situations where there is no way out, but there are situations where we can find the way out. But until we find that way out, we can't say no to live this lifestyle. End quote. Marx and Tupac are both subject to hatred on account of being members of a despised minority of a prejudiced society. Alien elements. It would be understandable and even sympathetic if these two men opted for what are common strategies when pressed to express themselves on their own peers by the ruling order: to denounce, to dissociate, to declare either that their stereotype is false, which usually initiates a messy discussion, whence the stereotype then, or to concede the stereotype but plead that they are one of the good ones. The greatness of the strategy chosen by Marx and Tupac lies in that they refuse to grant the existence of a large gulf separating polite society from its target of exclusion. They reject the very conceit that their interlocutor is in a position to pass judgment on anybody. A Jewish huckster in 1840s Germany and a black gangster in 1990s America, targets of untrammeled social scorn and vitriol, are held up in each case by the men as a reflection of the rotten society that deems itself so superior. They firmly assert, we or they may not be innocent, but neither are you or us. For those unsure whether this interpretation of Marx's intent stands to expert scrutiny, the view that Tupac and Marx's arguments are commensurate can be defended with reference to existing Marxological experts, such as Oxford University David Leopold. Quote, in short, the focus of Marx's discussion of rights in the Jewish question is provided by Bauer's insistence that the religious and egoistic nature of Jews makes them ineligible as bearers of human rights. Whereas Bauer took the received language in which the Christian majority abused the Jewish minority as egoistic individuals who worship money and repeated it, Marx took that language and extended it so as to include the majority Christian population as egoistic individuals who worship money. The widespread derogatory association was an exclusive one, in that it suggested that Jews were egoistic in a way that the Christian majority were not. This exclusive association was endorsed by Bauer and rejected by Marx. However, the form of Marx's rejection is significant. That exclusive association could be challenged in two ways. Either one might question the association as such, or one might question the exclusivity of that association. Marx's linguistic extension adopts the latter strategy." End quote. We can also eschew experts and simply notice that there is in fact a clear continuity between Marx's very controversial 1844 formulations and his much celebrated bars from only a few months earlier. In late 1843, notice how different this reads to much of what passes for critique of religion, or consumerism today. Quote, "Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for the real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions." End quote. Nothing human is alien to me. This is what Marx chose as his maxim, and it's apt, for it defines his entire body of work. At the same time, he engaged in the project of identifying and understanding social classes and class struggle. He refused to imbue them with rigidity or eternality, or to establish, as colonizers self-servingly did, genetic and psychological hierarchies. He did not see himself as outside of the class project he was analyzing. This required him to insist on understanding the rational kernel within the mystical shell, the logic underlying what we deem the madness or even villainy of another, even the miserly capitalist. This is precisely what enables Marx to truly discover and understand the inner secrets of capitalism, far surpassing myriad predecessors who satisfied themselves with ever more strident and grandstanding denunciations of its evils. Is this a superior approach? If so, why? Consider by way of stark contrast the attitude of Marx's contemporary rivals in anti-capitalist organization in 19th century Europe. Anarchists took immense pride in what they felt was their far more uncompromising break with the existing state of affairs. Why attempt to understand something as vile as the ruling class? Does it amount to anything other than its rationalization? Why attempt to take over their grotesque weapon, the state? Should it not instead be abolished outright? This aggressive pursuit of a sharp break, this summoning of moral indignation towards the end of rejecting any possible explanation for why undesirable things might have naturally arisen in the first place, eventually landed two leading lights of the anarchist movement, first P.J. Proudhon in France and later Mikhail Bakunin in Russia, directly in a rabid and conspiratorial anti-Semitism. Quote, "Jews, write an article against this race that poisons everything by sticking its nose into everything without ever mixing with any other people. Demand its expulsion from France, with the exception of those individuals married to French women. Abolish synagogues and not admit them to any employment. Demand its expulsion. Finally, pursue the abolition of this religion. It's not without cause that the Christians call them Decides. The Jew is the enemy of humankind. They must be sent back to Asia or exterminated. H. Hine, A. Whale, and others are nothing but secret spies. Rothschild, Camus, Marx, fooled, wicked, bilious, envious, bitter, etc., beings who hate us. The communism of Marx seeks enormous centralization in the state. And where such exists, there must inevitably be a central state bank. And where such a bank exists, the parasitic Jewish nation, which speculates on the work of the people, will always find a way to prevail." End quote. The anti-Semitic bile here, in both cases, turns out to be far more than a colorful sideswipe. Anarchist simplistic understanding of the causes of evil renders them nihilists. They are unable to conceive of class struggle as anything else other than the annihilation of whomever or whatever they have deemed other. Marx, in On the Jewish Question and elsewhere, always pursues a more complex project. Quote, "The right of man to private property is, therefore, the right to enjoy one's property and to dispose of it at one's discretion, without regard to other men, independently of society. the right of self-interest. This individual liberty and its application form the basis of civil society. It makes every man see in other men not the realization of his own freedom, but the barrier to it. Hence, man was not freed from religion. He received religious freedom. He was not freed from property. He received freedom to own property. He was not freed from the egoism of business. He received freedom to engage in business. End quote. Quote, estrangement appears not only in that the means of my life belong to another, and that my desire is the inescapable possession of another, but also in that all things are other than themselves, and that, and this goes for capitalists too, an inhuman power rules over all. End quote. Quote, it's not individuals who are set free by free competition. It is rather capital which is set free. It is therefore absurd to regard buyer and seller, these bourgeois economic types, as eternal social forms of human individuality, as it is preposterous to weep over them as signifying the abolition of individuality. End quote. The way I see it, a properly Marxist analysis of the world relentlessly attempts to understand and make sense of everything, every phenomenon and every state of affairs. Thus, one cannot simultaneously claim to belong to the Marxist tradition and then be satisfied by rambling about puppets and puppet masters and the CIA and sheeple. Any account in which two antagonistic human categories conjured appear equally alien to the self-righteous and enlightened critic of society is a non-starter. Strategy and imagination. Quote, you see, dear reader, so much of what's doled out as punk merely amounts to saying I suck. You suck, the world sucks, and who gives a damn, which is, somehow insufficient. Don't ask me why, I'm just an observer, really. But any observer could tell that, to put it in terms of us versus them, saying the above is exactly what they would want you to do, because it amounts to capitulation. Lester Banks, 1977. Quote, we live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but then, so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art. Very often in our art, the art of words. Ursula K. Le Guin. What are the strategic consequences of decisively rejecting the tripartite social theory advanced by Orwell and adopting Marx's all-encompassing one instead? The basic call to action looks something like this. 1. Stop accusing the masses of being brainwashed. Stop treating them as cattle. Stop attempting to rouse them into action by scolding them with exposure to unpleasant truths. 2. Accept instead that they've been avoiding those truths for a reason. You were able to break through the propaganda barrier, and so could they if they really wanted to. Many of these people see you as the fool, and in many cases not without reason. 3. Understanding people as intelligent beings, craft a political strategy that convincingly makes the case for why they and their lot are very likely to benefit from joining your political project, not in some utopian infinite timescale, but soon. 4. If you cannot make this case, then forget about convincing the person in question. Focus instead on finding other people to whom such a case can be made. This will lead you directly to class analysis. I began this essay by relating the tough lesson that people often weren't receptive to my research into anti-communist atrocity propaganda narratives. However, this wasn't the only lesson I learned in all this time. I also learned about an actually effective strategy against anti-communist propaganda, centered around a steady share of positive communist accomplishments, both contemporary and historical. I learned it from other folks, because it did not come naturally to me. The dynamics at play are palpable. When people are on board with positive accomplishments, they shred false negatives and reason through the real negatives all on their own. Debunks of atrocity propaganda are still very useful, just not in the way I originally imagined. Initially, I hoped that sheer anger at becoming aware of imperialist machinations would elicit a response, but now I instead think of them as an auxiliary tool. Sharing positives is primary, and debunks are secondary. Secondary, however, does not mean optional. There's a persistent myth that social accomplishments like sane pandemic management or quality public transit come at the cost of one's soul. Confronted with such a notion, appeals to hypocrisy, for example, insisting one's soul is already foregone due to complicity in Western genocides, are worse than useless. Insofar as they read like a confession, they are extremely harmful. A confident, evidence-based rejection of such claims is both a more principled and a more effective strategy. All it takes is work. Perhaps this may seem like too much dwelling in the realm of rhetoric, but here it is important to affirm that a rejection of liberal idealism shouldn't send one packing straight into mechanical materialism. Marxism is alternatively referred to as dialectical materialism for a reason. There's no shame whatsoever in thinking about how to approach engagement in the realm of ideas calmly and strategically. Moving into more polemic territory now, the usefulness of Orwell and Nietzsche to the ruling class suggests that communists in North America, in their effort to distance themselves from all talk no walk intelligentsia, have too reflectively shrunk from some important ideological tasks. One of them is the articulation of a compelling, realistic collective vision for the future, a task which cannot eternally be deferred as an implementation detail for after the revolution or after seizure of power. Mere statements of virtue and principle simply won't cut it. There is even a more pressing issue, however. If we accept that the so-called victims of propaganda in the imperial core don't really believe fabricated facts and figures, but instead more casually go along with them, a controversial but essential conviction of mine follows. We should not treat the content of news media and entertainment media all that differently, and we should treat entertainment media much more seriously than we currently do. In the realm of opposing atrocity propaganda, I'd say communists already far outclass imperial propagandists. The writing is more rigorous and the evidence is much more clearly laid out and readily verifiable. The problem is that we're failing to get people to the point where they even care about facts in the first place. It's absurd to see people rabidly complaining about, say, BBC's China reporting being rife with Orientalist falsehoods, then turn around and make excuses for why the same exact stereotypes must be tolerated or even praised as they worm their way through high-budget entertainment productions. It's absurd to see communists defend sinking dozens upon dozens of hours into reactionary, soul-crushing media like Breaking Bad or Mad Men or Game of Thrones, then turn around to ridicule and condemn the entire realm of ideological struggle as mere superstructure. A common refrain goes, the news must be reported correctly, but let people enjoy things. Artistic freedom is sacrosanct. I deem this nonsense liberalism. When we do this, what we throw out the window comes right around through the back door. In reality, entertainment media and news media serve the same propaganda purpose. They target not our reasoned beliefs about right and wrong, but our perception of social risk and reward. People's actual rationality, their ability to discern cause and effect, is far too resilient to be tampered with when their own immediate interests are at stake. People's pride, however, is much more malleable. For communists to refuse to challenge media that makes them invisible, or worse, aggressively humiliates them, is to surrender before the fight is even scheduled. And I genuinely believe that we do this every single time we refuse to challenge an Orwellianism or a Nietzscheanism. We have largely failed to create nourishing communist alternatives, not only in reality as with the Black Panther breakfast program, but also as far as the imagination goes. And in the realm of imagination, as in others, nature abhors a vacuum. In absence of social realist agitprop, Orwellianism thrives. Lenin titled his world-changing revolutionary pamphlet directly after Chernyshevsky's beloved and influential revolutionary fiction novel, What Is to Be Done. Stalin took his pseudonym, Koba, from the Patricide, a heroism romance novel that was popular in Georgia when he was a youth. We could speak similarly of Mao's esteem for Lu Xun and Water Margin. Asata has spoken about the insidiously grim messaging in our media. Where is our revolutionary fiction today? Anarchist authors like Ursula Le Guin often appear the closest thing we've got to mainstream communist literature. I genuinely think that if one can truly imagine in fiction a viable transition from our current state of affairs into a better one, that plays a huge role in mustering the conviction to assert that it can be achieved in reality. Conversely, if we cannot even imagine what a transition might look like in our wildest dreams, any real organization is doomed. I feel strongly about the idea that politics and art matters because art has affected how I view the world. Therefore, since I reject the idea that there's some kind of unbridgeable gap between me and the masses, I imagine it has to matter to everyone else too. More generally, I imagine that what I feel are my needs, food, peace, society, ego, dignity, are also the needs of others. This categorical rejection of entertainment versus news segues into the rejection of heart versus mind divide, the feelings versus facts divide, and the morality versus intelligence divide. These are all liberal delusions arising from the powerful justifying their abuse, and the powerless coping with the consolation prize of self-righteousness. As long as we Marxists continue to operate in environments where everyone's ideas about what the past was like and what the future can be like remain vague and noticeably beholden to the reactionary elitism of the likes of Orwell and Nietzsche and other cultural gatekeepers, any kind of revolutionary communist movement will rely solely on material desperation to rally adherents. If we want to take the initiative here, we must cease to celebrate the telling of hard truths for their own sake. We must begin to demonstrate to people how social organizations can solve our problems, with schematics as well as with stories. So rather than pity or scorn the collective as self-styled outsiders, we take pride in seeing and recognizing ourselves as individuals within it. Quote, "This is how they survive. You must know this. You're too smart not to know this. They paint the world full of shadows and then tell their children to stay close to the light. Their reasons, their judgments. Because in the darkness, there can be dragons. But it isn't true. We can prove that it isn't true. In the dark, there is discovery. There is possibility. There is freedom in the dark, once someone has illuminated it. And who has been so close to doing it as we are right now? Captain Flint, Black Sails." Quote, "One acquires in the face of work the old joy, the joy of fulfilling a duty, of feeling important within the social mechanism, of feeling oneself a cog that has its own unique characteristics that is necessity, although not indispensable to the production process. And moreover, a conscious cog, a cog that has its own engine, driven further and further every time in order to bring about to happy conclusion one of the key premises of socialist construction, the availability of a sufficient quantity of consumer goods for the entire population." Che Guevara, 1964. In the final analysis, no matter how radically anti-system the thinker appears to be, understanding society in terms of, on the one hand, rebels and on the other, masses controlled by elites, turns out to be a particular instance of a more general tendency: liberalism. Liberalism counterposes the interest of the individual to the interest of the collective, a rhetorical sleight of hand that illogically and wrongly implies that the collective isn't made up of individuals. It may seem scholastic to harp on logical issues here, but notice how ubiquitous this innocent-seeming rallying cry turns out to be. Like Orwell, it's not only favored by capital L liberals, but also by anarchists and conservatives and every other radical liberal. Not such a small feat. As it turns out, we can derive the entire logic of colonial history from this tiny axiom. Liberal rhetoric does not stop at an uncompromising, one-sided, and absolute defense of a set of individual rights. It transitions seamlessly and with equivalent passion into a defense of the family, the business enterprise, an economic class, a race, a nation, an empire. When we proudly assert that we are for the individual over the collective, we're essentially saying that some people count as people and some don't. At the heart of liberalism lies dehumanization. We should not forget that slave ownership was one of the original individual rights that was so fiercely fought for by the American revolutionaries. Therein is the argument against socialist states. Every death under socialism is a failure of the government because it dared to try to solve problems collectively. Under capitalism, deaths are due to individuals' failures, and therefore no one's responsible. There is the ability to justify, angrily and self-righteously, calling for a return to normal in the face of mass death and disablement. The good news is that we're further along than we think in overturning the state of affairs. If we relinquish the anarcho-liberal fantasies of utopia, where we no longer work, if we instead accept that we're workers, if we're able to do so with pride, many realistic victories turn out to be very much within reach. Everywhere that workers already work hard, they simply need to socialize the fruits of their already socialized labor. Admittedly, reorganizing production isn't a trivial task. However, the point here is that our social mechanism already offers ample proof that our skills and abilities are in plentiful supply. We already accumulated Alexandrian libraries of scientific knowledge as well as entertainment and the ability to produce infinitely more without any help from capitalists. Capitalists don't fear individual rebels. They shower us with such bohemian stories. They fear exactly the opposite. The proliferation of an authentic working-class consciousness that pointedly rejects their idle-rich lifestyle as everyone's ultimate ideal. The hatred of herd mentality ultimately derives from the aristocratic hatred of the collective wisdom of the underclass, of their choosing to work together in order to defend themselves from predators that would otherwise pick them off one by one. The project of repurposing this elitist attitude towards utopian goals is a dead end. If you want to be radical, then begin by radically rejecting the oldest and most vicious and most widespread bit of ruling class ideology, the idea that there is no wisdom whatsoever to be found in the behavior of the masses. Reject the idea of brainwashing and insist on seeking the kernel of intelligence and truth and wisdom in everyone's current actions, even when they seem repulsive or hopelessly short-sighted. Identify where exactly you can intervene and with whom, and in such a way that it dovetails with existing tendencies, but always with an eye to revolution and the price of a better future. Address yourself to reality in just this way, and you might just begin to change it.